And I want to welcome you all. My name is Cynthia Cutting from the Museum of the White Mountains, and I'm really pleased to be here this evening to introduce and host this wonderful talk. Our friend, Adam Keul, has been a friend to the museum and a collaborator with us for several years and brings his class to the museum. And it's really wonderful to have him here as a speaker. He was also our project humanist for wayfinding maps of the White Mountains. So you will see quotes from his essay and his work on the kind of premise of the exhibition in the exhibition if you come and see it. So first I'd like to thank our members and our advisory council for their support of the museum and its work that helped us to continue through the dark times in this last year and a half and made it possible for us to reopen with this wonderful exhibit and to present the right series of talks. Also really important to thank our grantor, New Hampshire Humanities, that gave us a grant that funded this entire series. So really makes it possible for us to make these evenings happen. We're really glad that this evening will also be recorded, so it will be part of the archive that you'll be able to tell your friends and family to visit online. You'll be able to listen in and review it again, as I do. I go back and listen to them again, and I learn more each time. So it's a wonderful tool for us to kind of embellish and enrich our exhibit experience. So thank you to our members. If you're not yet a member of the Museum of the White Mountains, we invite you to join us. You'll find our membership link on our website, and we would love to have you as part of our conversation. As we move forward, the museum is always welcoming other people's ideas about the kinds of topics, the kinds of material that we should be investigating and presenting. And so your voice matters to us. So we welcome your participation. So tonight I'm so pleased to welcome Adam, and I'll just tell you a little bit about him. Adam is professor of tourism, management, and policy at Plymouth State University, where he's been for several years. He holds a master's of interdisciplinary studies in geography, forestry, and history, and a PhD in geography from Florida State University. Adam's research focuses on the conception and production of spaces as resources for tourism development and understanding how their integrity is maintained as sources of ecological and cultural significance. His research and writing includes political economic geography, tourism studies, political ecology, resource geographies, and animal geographies. And I'm so proud and pleased that he's with us here this evening. And so Adam, it's up to you. Take it away.
Okay, great. First of all, you can hear me, right?
Yes.
All right. Well, thanks, Cynthia and Rebecca and everybody who donated their maps, the other Adam, right, for the exhibit. And especially thanks, Cynthia, for everything you've done over the past few years here. You've made our little museum really something to talk about. So I appreciate it. But yeah, so I'm Adam Keul. This is The Map is Not the Territory. It wouldn't be an appropriate academic talk if I had the exact same title as I started out with. So the subtitle is a little different, but it's the same concept of philosophy and politics of mapping in the White Mountains. So as Cynthia said, I have a PhD in geography, so I'm a human geographer. And as a geographer, you know, I obviously have an interest in maps. My house is full of maps, and actually, I like to say, if you looked at my room when I was 12 years old, it looks pretty much the same as my office does at PSU right now, with flags and maps everywhere. So I'm definitely a cartophile. Now, as a geographer, my appointment is in tourism. I've done lots of my research in tourism, so I kind of look at the development of tourism as a geographer. But really, my approach is a lot broader. I work in social theory in general, and I tend to look at things from a really 50,000 foot view. And as a geographer, we're very broad, so it can draw from all sorts of different fields: history, anthropology, sciences, and so forth. So, and of course, humanities. And I have to say, Project Humanist is probably the coolest title I've ever acquired. It's a good one. So,
Adam, can I just, sorry, interject? I forgot to say, if anyone has questions throughout Adam's talk, please put them in the chat, and Rebecca will gather them and pose them to Adam at the end of his presentation. Sorry.
Excellent. No worries. That actually gives me a chance I want to start my timer so I don't go way too far over. So, that being said, because of sort of my outlook on geography and on this topic, we're going to talk about the whole world, not just the White Mountains, and lots of different eras. And hopefully there's some consistency to everything I'm saying. I have a couple of caveats or warnings, I guess. It's strangely, I have avoided ever doing a Zoom talk before because I was on leave over the whole COVID. So I'm still a little new at this, but I think I got it figured out. Also, I always try to not have too much text on the screen for any talks and lectures I do for students too, but I always fail. But I will read this text to you, and it prevents me from having a full-fledged script to read the talk because I don't like doing it that way. So hopefully it won't be too busy, right? So the main topic that I want to talk about today from a philosophical standpoint is representation. And that really, representation is what mapping is, and what, cartography and spatial representation is what it is. And if that's not a concept you're familiar with, what it really is the act of creating stand-ins from the real world in your experience to represent them, right? Symbols for actual things. And, this is a very classic, characteristic human thing to do. And so, in a sense, people have been representing the world in one way or another for at least 100,000 years, and that's really just because that date comes from the earliest types of art ever found. But obviously, there's probably a lot that went on before that. We just don't have evidence of. So, and in fact, we know that even other species of humans had representative capacity. Homo naledi, Denisova floresiensis. So it's an old capability, but it's very classic human stuff to do. So what are representations, these symbols for actual things? Obviously, maps are symbols for space, but there's so many other ways that we represent things. History, pictures, films are representations, marketing, things like customer reviews, right? Think about how powerful those are for a hotel or something. It's a representation of your experience. How was it? What else do I have? Satellite images, memories, paintings, taxidermy, representation of an animal, deeds, diaries, maps, so many things, books about places. And of course, the representation doesn't only have to be spatial, but that's where, as a geographer, I'm stuck, is in the spatial. So that's how we kind of dissect the in philosophy of mapping, is start looking at it just as representation. So I'll go through that a little bit, or no, there we go. Okay, there's my title, sorry. All right, so representation is a really useful thing, and it has really great advantages for living on Earth. Sorry, I had to move my little thing out of the way. Okay, there we go. So to begin with, representation takes an abstract idea and then uses it to create a material symbol for that idea. And that allows people to carry a heck of a lot of information about the world and be able to reproduce it for other people. A cartographic representation, which is, or I could really just say a spatial representation, because cartography is sort of a specific type of spatial representation. But a spatial representation is made by having an experience of a place and then creating, in your head, an abstract idea about that space, and then creating some sort of material symbol to represent that space. Now, I'll sort of use space and place here, both of them interchangeably. That's a lot longer talk to talk about the difference of those. But so I came up with sort of a random notion of a spatial representation. I like to play disc golf, and like going to, this is at Wildcat, I believe, this image. If you had an experience of disc golf, and then you took that experience and had an idea about, that you wanted to represent disc golf somehow, and you wanted to do it spatially, you then could create a symbol that represented it. And this is a map of the few disc golf courses in our region. It has a lot of holes in it, but so that's just a simple map, and that's probably a map that has never been, it's certainly not in the exhibit. So, but it's such a useful thing to do. We can represent everything, right? Now, one way I like to a metaphor to compare it to is, in a lot of ways, representations of space are similar to money, right? The way that money represents value, right, it makes it more portable, right, is really similar to the way that spatial representations represent space. And really, with that metaphor of money, it's a perfect example, because the problem with representation, or one of the problems, is that it's incomplete, right? It's always a part of a space, and because of that, it's never objectively true. And really, money is the same way. Money does a good job of representing value, but it doesn't ever completely represent value, as much as we may think it does. So useful stuff, representation, but it's got some loopholes, let's just put it that way. So what I like to call the dilemma of representation, I'm going to talk about a couple different dilemmas of this act. First of all, representations are always imperfect. Whether it's the level of detail, what you include, what you don't include, you can't. That's the title of the talk, right? The map is not the territory, right? So by definition, they're not going to contain everything. Now, this is the most classic of the sort of problem of representation, and it's a famous painting. I'll tell you a little bit about it in a minute. But if you don't speak French, it says, "This is not a pipe." And I use it often in class to talk about this too. Like, I'll say, "Hey, this is not a pipe. What is it?" Right? And the simple answer, right, is, what is it? It's a picture of a pipe. Well, but not really. It's your monitor's representation of a PowerPoint slide with a JPEG file of a screenshot of a picture of a painting of a pipe at Los Angeles County Museum of Art. So there's so many layers to to this non-pipe that and in each one of those layers, things are gained or lost. There's certain power relations that are going on. It's probably not that much. The power relations of the pipe painting are not that impactful, I guess, but at the same time, it's not a pipe. And it's called, the name of this painting is A Treachery of Images. It's by René Magritte, who's a Belgian painter. It was made in 1929, and he has his quote about the pipe, and I don't have it written down, but it's basically like, could I stuff the pipe? Could I like the pipe? It's not a pipe. It's an image, right? So, but as humans, we sort of go, yeah, okay, we can skip all that. We realize that it's not a pipe, but when you gloss over all of the things that are unreal about it, it kind of opens the door for all kinds of different problems. And this is the same concept with the map. So the map is not the territory. You can't have a 1-to-1 map, right? You can have a 1-to-2 map or 1 to 50,000, but a 1-to-1 map is really being in a place, living in the lived experience of it. So in the West, especially, the drive in the past, well, in 500 years, has to make maps more accurate, to contain more and more information and be more truthy, right? But this is kind of a culturally specific way of representing space. So, but it's important to remember, though, that it's never the map, right? There's never just the map. It's always someone's map. Now, it could be her, there, Google, but the point is that it doesn't sort of, the maps don't just emerge from thin air. They are created, and they're all created for a particular purpose, and they're created by particular people. And, it's easy to understand that if you think of some of these beautiful artistic classic maps that are in the exhibit. But even if you're talking about a Google image from a satellite, it's still someone programmed the aperture of the satellite to pick up certain things and not other things, and and the way they label it and all the colors. It's still a human creation in every sense. So because of that, just like art, just like novels, just like language itself, maps are inherently cultural and political products. You can't get away from that. They are human. So because of that, there is a necessary, or there can be a power imbalance in terms of who's making the map, why they're making it. So this in geography, we talk about this concept, particularly with regard to colonialism. And there's a Latin phrase that we use called terra nullius, which is this idea that I have yet to find a map that has the words terra nullius on it. But it's this idea of mapping something and basically saying that there's nothing there, right? So back in the day, we would translate that as no man's land, but I feel like there was probably some women involved too, so I just like to say nobody's land. So by mapping a place, it could be a colonial act, a huge projection of power. So if you wanted to go conquer a land, the first thing you should do is make a map that says nobody lives here, right? Even though you obviously know that they do. And this was an act that was really meaningful in Australia. So you can see this this image of an early map, and it says, notice it says Terra Australis Incognita, which means the unknown southern land. And we get used to this Terra Incognita, but obviously there were thousands and thousands of people there when that map was created, and I think they probably knew about it, right? So the unknownness of it is really from the European perspective. So lots of power built into those notions of terra nullius, terra incognita. But even in a more naive sense, or maybe not naive, in a less what's the word? It doesn't always make that huge of a difference, right? It's you can map something and not intend on colonizing it, right? So the power of representation is great because of that political part. So okay, we're in good shape. Now, when you create a space, and Doreen Massey, who's one of my hero geographers, talks a lot, I'll have a quote from her in a minute, about how mapping is producing a space, right? It's creating it for sort of an audience somewhere else. And I thought of a really relevant way to think about this to get the idea across of how powerful that can be. And in New Hampshire, we're all very familiar with this, especially those of us who live in the White Mountains. And it's this notion, right? This secret place, right? This awesome waterfall, this great swimming hole. And the whole idea is don't tell anybody about it, right? Because You know what happens if you tell people is people start showing up, right? And then it kind of, as Matthew talks about, the trajectory of the place totally changes. And so the worst thing you can do for an awesome swimming hole is put it on a damn map, right? Because then it'll get taken over. And in a lot of ways, this is the same fundamental process that happened when Europeans began to come and map the Americas and really all over the world. So an example of that is this Codex Schlotl, which is an Aztec map made by the Mexica. From this image is the codices are like 50 pages long, so this is only one chunk of it. But this image in particular shows 200 years of history, right? And I think the map that representation itself is a good foray into understanding how different cultures understand space completely differently. That you could have a map that has space built into it, spirituality and history that's built into the map. So it's like a four-dimensional concept. And when she writes about, Doreen Massey writes about the moment, you know, that Cortez comes to Tenochtitlan, and how much power that she brought. I mean, that Cortez brought just by simply mapping it. I love this quote about it. She says, "Immobilized, they await Cortez's or ours or global capital's arrival. They lie there on space in place without their own trajectories. Such a space makes it more difficult to see in our mind's eye the histories the Aztecs were, now I can't see it, were already had been living and producing." So the idea here is that they had their own history, they had their own space, and it was independent from European. But once Europeans, you know, put it on a map and write home about it, then, you know, it's the cat's out of the bag, right? And obviously we know what happened in that situation, and so it was bad news. Okay, so really the extent of power in a map here, to sort of summarize it, it all comes from who makes it and why they make it, right? And if you can understand those two questions, you can really dig into what power inheres in any map. All right, nope, click and click. So, oops, okay. So I have here two representations of the same space that are 497 years apart. And each of them have very different political motivations, and I'm going to dig into that a little bit. The first is this. This is an image that I took off of Google Earth, one of my favorite spaces in the world. Google Earth. This is too, though. And you know, this is the presidential ridge, probably familiar to most of you. You can see on there, old bridle path, lots of photos that people put. The other one that I'm going to counter against it is this. This is an image of Giovanni di Verrazzano's diaries from 1524. And so in these diaries is the very first European representation of the White Mountains. And it's a very short little mention that he makes, and it's just a little note on the side that says there are high mountains within the land, right? Now, he did not particularly get out of the ship very much in New England, or, you know, today's New England. This observation was probably made somewhere around the coast of Portland, Maine. And I think it's really fascinating to imagine that you could see the White Mountains from the coast, right? Which you can today. Every now and then, it's probably more likely you can see the coast from the White Mountains, right? But certainly there was 40,000 Abenaki living here at that point. That's the estimate. And obviously their economy was quite different than the economy today and didn't produce as much pollution. So you could probably see a lot further. But him simply writing that into his journal and sending it back to the King of France, is who he worked for, it really opens the door for all sorts of new understandings of space. So the two purposes of these two representations of space are very different, right? And I have them circled there. So the 2021 Google versus the Verrazano. You know, his idea, his purpose of making any representation or coming there was simply to chart it, to make charts so that future people could sail there. And so he didn't really care about the mountains. He's just noting that they're there, and he's going to spread the word. And I like to say, you know, he probably was like, well, maybe if I write about this, someday they'll name a bridge after me. And you know what? Sure enough. So the purpose of the Google map, in its most fundamental sense, is to make money, right? Google's a corporation. So obviously, we hope that they want to share information with the world. There's not only to make money, but in a lot of ways, if they didn't make money, they wouldn't be doing it. So very, very different motivations in mapping, and obviously very different representations, but they're talking about the same space. So I want to delve a little bit now into wayfinding, which I was really pleased that that was the title rather than mapping or cartography, because wayfinding is a lot more broad sense of spatial representation. Western understandings of spatial representation are even though they're probably they're dominant, right? They are still limited and culturally specific. They tend to be focused on accuracy, detail, and number one, permanence, right? So we don't generally make maps to throw them away. They take a lot of work. We want to share them. We want to copyright them. But wayfinding is a way to navigate space with impermanent objects. And the reason it's important to understand this is both because on a global scale, wayfinding exists all over the world and has for a long time, but also we know that the indigenous people here, the Abenaki, used wayfinding. And I'll have a couple quotes in a minute that there's not a whole lot that I've been able to find about Abenaki cartographic practice. But a little bit that says, hey, you know, of course they made sorts of maps and they'd used wayfinding. So in places where permanent maps are unnecessary, symbols of wayfinding are found. I like to think of a wayfinding symbol as kind of similar to a grocery list, right? Which this is a really great one: nuts, scotch, and Cheerios. It sounds like a good evening. But you know, you write a grocery list because for its function. Help me remember to buy the stuff I need. But you don't have any intention of keeping it. It makes no sense. So it's really a functional object. Whereas wayfinding devices or practices are basically the same thing. Here, I'm going to use this to show people where I went, how to get somewhere. But if it all gets knocked down, it's no big deal. It served its purpose. So I have a couple of kind of classic examples of wayfinding. And then I will show you what I know about the Abenaki wayfinding, and then we're going to hopefully watch a little video about it. It's only a minute long. So the most classic, you know, from the geographer's standpoint, the most classic wayfinding object is the Polynesian stick chart. And Polynesian stick charts are used by all sorts of people in the Pacific as a way to navigate between islands. Now, what you can see on there, basically there's little shells on the intersections. The shells are islands. The lines are currents in the ocean. And so if you made this, it was based on thousands of years of knowledge, and it showed you how to get from one island to the other. The fascinating thing about them is that they are not made to be at all. They're made to be made, used, and thrown away. And so all of that cartographic and spatial understanding and intelligence was just in the people themselves who could make it. There's a Polynesian stick chart in the Smithsonian. They're really cool. It's a really cool practice. Another classic example are Inuksuk, or plural Inuksiuk. These are wayfinding devices used in the Arctic by Inuit people that are used both to show where to go, you know, where to find, you know, game. All sorts of things are built into that. And actually, the word Inuksuk means a symbol. I didn't write down the exact translation, but it's like a symbol of a person, right? Like a representative of person. So as you can see on their flag, that's the Nunavut flag. An Inukshuk is supposed to look like a person who's pointing in a particular direction. So those are other similar wayfinding devices. Now, we know that Abenaki used wayfinding, and I'm sure they still do to some extent. And I found a couple of sources about this. To begin with, though, it's important to understand that the Abenaki relationship with the White Mountains itself is certainly different than the relationship that Europeans had, or that it was 500 years ago. Prince notes that their relationship with Mount Washington in particular was one of reverence, and that they purportedly did not venture deep into the mountains due to their sacred religious status. Now, I can think of a lot of sacred religious rules that people make that aren't always followed. So I kind of take that with a grain of salt, because I feel like certainly somebody, some heretic perhaps, climbed into the mountains. I don't know, but I find it a little hard to believe. But at the same time, this brings up a question that I think I could talk about all day, and that kind of, is that drive to go hike to the top of a mountain something that's fundamentally human? Or is it a kind of Western ideology, Western outlook on mountains in the sense of conquering, right? You climb to the top of the mountain to conquer it, right? It's a tough thing to say, right? In my mind, I'm like, well, who wouldn't want to climb to the top of a mountain, right? It's like an obvious goal, but I don't know. It could be culturally relative too. So anyway, that's sort of an aside. Now, specific to the Abenaki, although there are no indication that they kept permanent cartographic collections, there's evidence that they made maps for temporary needs. And I think it's so important to learn to recognize that the impermanence of it does not make it in any way lesser, right? Wayfinding devices, they suited their function, right? If they didn't, they wouldn't have used them. And so they're not lesser, they're just different. We wouldn't say that, using a Polynesian stick chart is primitive, it's just older. And in fact, wayfinding is still around. So it's a modern thing, but it's also an older practice, older than cartography specifically. And it's not necessarily more or less valuable. The way to comparison with that is like the idea of written language, right? Most languages were not written around the world, and they serve their purpose just fine. It's not like having written language makes the language more mature or better. If it survived the language, that means that it did, it served its function. And so in the same way, the wayfinding practices kind of work that same way. Okay, keep going. Now, I have this other quote that was great. When they are in the woods, to say, I am going east, a stick is stuck in the ground pointing in that direction. I'm not gone far, a different stick. Gone far is the reverse, the number of days in the journey. The idea is that you can encode so much information into a wayfinding device that if you didn't understand it, you walk up and it looks like a pile of sticks, but there's so much information built into it if you know what it's trying to say. Now, I was watching this wonderful documentary just the other day. It's called Borneo Death Blow. It's about the Penang in Borneo in Indonesia, and they hunt with poison arrow blow darts, which is just cool. But I found this excellent little foray in that the filmmaker's name is Rafael Treza. That he is speaking to this Penang man about navigating the jungle. And he speaks directly to this idea of wayfinding. Now, in our practices, this did not work very well. So I'm going to play it anyway, and hopefully y'all can see it and see some of the translations so you can see what he's saying. And if it doesn't work, I'll summarize it real quick. Sorry. No. Okay. Yeah, and sorry, I have the free version of this film program, so it has the watermark in it. But okay, so if you couldn't hear it, I hope you get the idea. He's making a wayfinding device that shows other members of his group that they have food, they have medicine, they have where to get things, and just so much information built into something that it's a really foreign way to people in the United States, at least, a way to communicate spatial knowledge. So there's a lot of ways you can do this. Now, let's get back to specific maps. Now, this is a very classic map from 1500. It's the map of Juan de la Cosa. And it is the earliest undisputed representation of the Americas by Europeans. And undisputed means that everyone agrees that this one is the Americas, whereas there's a few that happened before this that they're not sure that they really count, but that's what that means. So if you look on the left side of your screen, you see these green areas and the northeastern coast of the American continent. I'm going to zoom in a little bit here so you can see a little bit better. So what you see here is Cuba. You can kind of recognize that. And hopefully I can remember to come back to this idea of recognizing shapes, because that is something that really connects spatial representation in general. My guess on where the White Mountains are here is about there-ish. And, this actually occurred before Verrazano. So he didn't say here's where they are, but this is sort of my trying to figure it out. The fascinating thing about this period and Verrazano, and specifically from about 1500 until at least 1650, Europeans believed that the northeast coast of the Americas was an isthmus. Like Florida, right? And that the Pacific was at most 15 days journey on the other side of the White Mountains, right? So obviously that's not true. And also similar, it was a common thought up until I want to say at least the early 19th century that the Mount Washington was the highest point in North America, and off a little bit on that one too. But they climbed to the top of a tree in like Cape Fear area of North Carolina and looked out and saw water on the other side of it. And they're like, oh, that's Pacific Ocean. That's got to be it, right? So just like Columbus and his, hey, we must be in India. They got a lot wrong. And I think it's important the reason I want to bring that up is because that the first map of something, the first European map at least, creates an extreme bottleneck of information, right? If this is the only thing you know about it, then you spread that information, and that's what people take to be the truth. And maps can really have a lot of power in that sense. I zoom in a little bit further and look what I found. Oh, look at that. Plymouth State University, right there it is. Okay, sorry. All right. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about the Abenaki presence in the White Mountains, beyond just we know that they used wayfinding. New Hampshire today is one of the states that has the lowest population of Native people. But even by around 1900, there were very few Abenaki in New Hampshire. Most of them had moved to Quebec by then. But they're obviously still here. But this is a really fascinating place, the Abenaki Indian Shop and Camp at Intervale near Conway. And I like to include it because I see it as a really good example of how Chief Joseph Laurent used tourism as a way to sort of reinsert the Abenaki into the imagined geography, the mindset of New Hampshire, right? So he was the chief of the Odanak, and he's actually the author of the very first Abenaki English dictionary, which, relevant to what we're talking about, is unique because it's written as a journey through their land. So it's like a spatial text, of a spatial writing, rather than just a list of words. And so to me, that shows a totally different understanding of space than the Europeans had. The fascinating, basically what he did in this period is he had a group of about 50 of the Odanak, Abenaki, that would come down in the summer, and they would sort of set up shop here at the site. And the site was co-owned by Laurent and a hotel owner. And this is from the actual register of the Historic Places document. The camp was a diversion for hotel guests who like to watch the Indians and who purchased their baskets. So it's, since even by 1900, the White Mountains was a vibrant tourism destination. And that means that if a lot of people are coming and experiencing it, remember that experience is the first step in representation. They come and experience it, then they go elsewhere, and it really spreads the word, right? And so he took advantage of this, kind of reclaim their part of the story, right? So that they could be a part of the story, even though there were very few of them there. Another object that to me has the same kind of bottleneck of power is like the old guidebooks, right? Like Chisholm's guidebook, that whenever it became fashionable to come to the White Mountains, people needed to know what they were supposed to look at, right? What's important? What am I supposed to see here? So if you buy a Chisholm's guide and it says, here's the 10 places you see, well, guess what? That's where everybody goes. And that's then what people know about it. And so the guidebook, like early maps, is really a bottleneck for information and for power. Now, as I start to sort of wind down here, I have these 4 different images of Plymouth. Now, despite all of the inherent dilemmas of representation, in that it's never perfect, it's imbued with power. We can't. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't have them. It doesn't mean that they're pointless, because when something is based in the real experience of a place, that there's a thread that ties all real experiences with that place together. And I like to think of it like this: if you lived here 1,000 years ago or 200 years ago, and you were very familiar with the White Mountains, you would probably appreciate places like Diana's Baths and Artist Bluff and the Basin, because they're either useful or they're just cool, right? I think that, the appeal of a big waterfall goes across cultures. And so no matter how they're represented, there is an actual place. And so the place itself is really what ties all those representations together, but they all can diverge greatly. So this is the Belknap map from 1791, the Morris map from 1890, and then a Rand McNally map, and then the Google Earth map. And what I want to point out here is this. This little ugly shape I drew, which is the confluence of the Pemmy Baker River. If you had no knowledge of mapping and you saw that drawn on there, you would get it, right? You would understand. I mean, yeah, of course the river changes course a little bit here and there, but it's still a real thing. And so the features of a landscape are really what hold a map together. And they present the same shape, right? Another idea here I thought about when I was writing this is like, you know, our classic New England expression, you can't get there from here, right? The idea of moving across the White Mountains from east to west is just as much of a problem 1,000 years ago as it is today. So certainly anyone who lived here at any point and tried to travel would be very well aware that it's tougher to go east-west than it is north-south. And I like to think that if you went back in time with a map of, you know, like a road map, they would look at I-93 and go, well, yeah, of course, that's where you'd want to put it, right? That's the only place that makes sense to have a path, right? So there is some reality and you know, some aspects of mapping that that go across cultures and that aren't just social constructs, but are, you know, they tie things together. So, as I say, human experience of the landscape underlies all cartographic representations of the White Mountains, despite their cultural context. So, the summary of that is that maps present a common language to places. They're kind of what can unite us about a place. The Exit 32 Visitor Center produces great maps of the White Mountains, and I love them because they have them in about 15 different languages. And so I like to have one that's written in Thai and hand it to the students, and they can figure it out because they recognize the shapes, right? So now, I am contradicting myself a little bit here because you and I probably wouldn't be able to interpret an Abenaki wayfinding device. So they're not 100% a common language, but the idea of representing spaces and experiencing the space is going to be collective to everyone. So a last few concluding points here. I feel like I'm doing decent on time, which is surprising. To kind of summarize everything, maps are always imperfect and never objective. You know, the most modernist thing you can do is say, like, this is the map, it's solved, we figured it all out, right? But we can only, you know, it only is correct when it meets its function, right? And there's a lot of ways to meet the functions necessary. Maps are cultural products. Of course, therefore, they are culturally relative. The way that you might want to represent space could be vastly different from the way somebody else would, even if you're working with the exact same landscape. Mapping is a political act and has definitely been used as a way to conquer places, to classify them as empty. And even, you know, even something like Google Earth is incredibly political, right? You know, they take stuff out and put stuff in to make sure that it suits the needs of the company and, you know, the nations, lots of ways. So the one way I think that you can objectively judge all maps and really all spatial representations is by their effectiveness, right? Their efficacy. I need to figure out how to get to the river. I can explain that to you in 1,000 different ways. And you know, if the purpose is, you know, if you get there, then it doesn't really matter how I did it. So in a lot of ways, I see maps in this sense as a kind of binary. It either worked or it didn't. It's like a key. If you can have a platinum, you know, platinum key autographed by Elvis, and you know, a boring regular key, and if they both unlock the door, you know, problem solved. So in a really functional sense, I think that's one way that we can compare maps. Obviously, beyond that, the aesthetics is a whole different layer of judging cartography, and that's really the beauty of the exhibit and the beauty of maps. So despite the inherent flaws of representation, maps are a common language of places. And the last way I'll compare this is you can certainly see representations of space and maps as a simulation, right? A simulation of another place. And in tourism, obviously, we have a lot of simulations. If you think about Epcot or you know, simulations of other countries or Santa's Village, and there's a tendency to say, like, well, that's not authentic, it's not real. you know, and to assume that it's less valuable. But recently, tourism scholars have been writing about this concept of post-tourism, and that's where you sort of, you accept that it's not real, but you can still have fun. You play with it, right? Like, you know that it's not actually Mickey Mouse in the costume, it's a person, but you pretend like it is, and it works for this function. So this is a good example of that here at Canberra Shaker Village, which is a simulation of a different time period, but we know that, right? We know that it's not not in the past, but we can still learn from it and get a lot out of it. And I think that's the same thing with maps. Like, we realize the map is not the territory, and we're not treating it as if it's 1,000% perfect and accurate. But as long as we can keep those political and cultural contingencies in mind, we can use maps, you know, easily without much consequence. I like to say that humans can handle simulations. We can handle things that are pretend, and you know, even if maps are pretend, they're really useful. We still get a lot out of it. So, thanks for attending, and I will answer questions if you'd like.
Thank you, Adam. That was just great. I love the idea of, and I love the idea of the different kinds of maps, accepting that they're not, you know, the thing, the final version of the map, but just enjoying them. And I think that's what the exhibit is all about. There's so many different kinds of maps in there that are just fun to enjoy and see what the different perspectives are. So thank you. That was such a great talk.
Thanks.
Awesome. And I know we have some questions. Rebecca,
great.
Can you find them for us?
Yes, absolutely. So our first question is from Karen. Do you think that the difference between maps of different cultures is related to how the languages of those people divide the world? Or rather, how do you think a culture's language influences their map making?
Wow, that's a great question. And I would say that because language is also, you know, a symbolic representation, even if, you know, whether it's written or not, there has to be an impact. I would go as far as to say, like, the way, you know, how a group interacts with the world they live in, you know, their understanding of space is also going to affect their understanding of language, and then also affect their understanding of mapping or wayfinding. So I think that the short answer is it has to. It's hard for me to say exactly how, but, you know, even things like place names, you know, the way that, you know, you use have multiple words for the same place, you have multiple words for, you know, the type of river it is, or if it's the water's high or low, or what time of year it is. You know, we have to accept that our description of the world is really varied all over the place. So yeah, that's a great question.
Great, thank you, Adam. All right, our next question is from John. If mapping and representation more broadly articulate power relations, are there mapping practices that run counter to colonialism, empire, and similar practices of dominant or conquering groups? There are definitely wayfinding practices. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, are there mapping practices that counteract?
Yep, are there mapping practices that run counter to colonialism? There are definitely wayfinding practices for African Americans during Jim Crow, migratory individuals, and many others. What about maps? If so, how were they shared?
Yeah, wow. So this gets to the real heart of the subdiscipline or field of critical cartography, which is, you know, critical cartography looks specifically at maps and power. And there's definitely a way to counter colonialism with maps. Yeah, what it actually reminds me of is I'm in the middle of reading Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, and it's kind of you know, it's a as the title says, it's an Indian history of the American West, and to me it's going at that same thing, like writing it from our point of view, whereas mapping can certainly work in the same way. this one isn't exactly anti-colonial, but there's a great project out of UCLA that's it's called a People's Geography of Los Angeles, and what it is specifically that it's creating representations of LA that are made from workers, from marginalized people, to show just to counter the standard narrative of like, oh, here's the maps to the stars' houses, right? To show that something, because when you put something on a map, you're automatically elevating its importance. That means that you're leaving out things that are considered not important enough. And so I've you know, if you say, hey, like something like, you know, the Tulsa massacre, right? You could, by leaving something like that out of a story, you know, it's just as powerful as, you know, it's a power play to leave something out just as much as it is to put something in. And so I've imagined what, as sort of a thought experiment, what an Aztec map of Europe would have looked like if they had come, you know, if they had come to Europe instead of the other way around. It would be radically different. And I think that you know, because once we accept that a map is a cultural product, if you are making it as a to counteract the dominant paradigm, then you can make it do that for sure, right? So even though the colonialist map and mapping in that sense is power laden, it definitely can be overturned.
Great, thank you, Adam. Next question, are there examples of maps that were deliberately designed to mislead or confuse? And
yeah, definitely. The place that comes into mind specifically to me is in the USSR, they made a lot of maps that were specifically designed to confuse people. And I believe that Washington, D.C. has done things like that in the past too, like, you know, more like during the Civil War era. But I think that to me is a great example of how we can, if we didn't put too much trust into maps, then we wouldn't have ever seen those sorts of things. Because people trust maps, they can be taken advantage of in a sense. So that, you know, again, whoever's making the map has a lot of power. And a lot of it has to do too with the popularity of it. You know, if I make a map that has things that are misleading on it, but, you know, it doesn't catch on, then it doesn't really matter. But if someone in a position of power, like, you know, if this is my Sununu map of New Hampshire, and, you know, it's, you know, inaccurate or whatever, that gains a lot of traction. So so I have heard of that in USSR, and I'm sure that it's happened in a lot of different places. I bet there's a paper written about it.
Thank you, Adam. I'm looking through the chat. I don't see any other questions here. There's some interesting comments. One comment from Ed said that this is a great compliment to Gould and White's mental maps from the 1970s. Our mental maps are translated into physical maps that reflect not only the designer's intent, but also the imperfection of the designer's concepts.
Yeah, I mean, mapping is just, it's so much broader than what we are taught and what we normally see, right? You know, like if you look back into like the Situationist International, like the idea of doing a derive, which is sort of a journey through a city that has no purpose, and using that as a mapping of a place, it's something that is so prevalent in all human society, but we kind of look at it through a really narrow you know, viewpoint. And yeah, lots of things to map.
With that, I think we are done. I think that was a great kind of finale. Thank you so much, Adam.
Yes, thank you, Adam.
Thank you all for having me. It's
yeah,
nice to do it again.
Really It's really great.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that we pulled it off after, I wrote this like 18 months ago. When I saw it on the board in the exhibit, I was like, I wrote that, didn't I? Wow.
Yeah,
Pretty
you're
good.
pretty smart. And thank you all for hanging in there. I understand there was some interference. I think it might have been from the storm that passed through. So thanks to those who got kicked off and came back in. I'm glad you're here. And thank you everybody for attending. This was a great, great talk. I'm going to have to go back and listen to it again because I really get this abstract concepts. I really, really enjoy that. So it makes me want to draw a map. Like I want to draw a map tonight.
A mind map.
Thank you, Adam. And anyone who has not yet been to the exhibition, please come and see Wayfinding. It is a wonderful exhibition. And like I said, you'll see Adam quoted throughout. And I think it's a great illustration of some of the concepts he shared with us this evening. So thank you, Adam. Thank you so much for doing it. Glad to have you here. And I hope to see all of you at the next talk coming up.